In this session, we're gonna ask the question: can we trust the Bible, and specifically the New Testament? That's where we're going to focus on. There are those that dispute that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. Scholars like Bart Ehrman, Giza Vermes, Charles Burlington Gateway believe that the Gospels were written hundreds of years after the events. Remember, we do not have the original copies in our possession. Our earliest copies date back as far as 130 AD, with the first complete copies of what we now call the books of the New Testament coming on the scene around AD 200. If Jesus died in AD 33, that means that our earliest complete copies of the New Testament books came on the scene about 170 years after his death. Many skeptics believe that this is enough time for legend to develop. But let's talk about some liberal bias. I'm always a fan of talking about liberal bias. I went to Wikipedia and I did a search on the Gospel of John. Now, obviously, Wikipedia is what Wikipedia is. This is not a seminary necessarily that went and put this information on there. But realistically speaking, a lot of people search Wikipedia and believe Wikipedia, and in many ways it's fairly credible. When I had a look at the Gospel of John, and specifically with regards to whether it was the eyewitness, John the Apostle, that wrote the Gospel of John, I found the following. Early Christian tradition, first attested by Irenaeus, 130 to 202, identified this disciple with John the Apostle. But most scholars have abandoned this hypothesis or hold it only tenuously. So there must be something out there that's absolutely horrible to refute the early fathers or church fathers' opinion that this book was actually written by the Gospel of John. What's intimated here is that there is a conspiracy, and you cannot rely on Scripture because changes were made. You shouldn't believe the Bible because stuff was invented. Miracles were added after the fact. Jesus never said that he was God, and too much time has transpired. You can't trust the Bible, people like that would say, because it's just not reliable. But let's look at, if we go on with the statement that they make on Wikipedia, what's this evidence that they give? Remember, we've got to have evidence. We've got our test for truth, our top 3 tests for truth that we've got. The first one is logical consistency. The second one is empirical adequacy, and then obviously experiential. Do we experience it like that? So let's see if this fits the bill for truth. So if we go on, it says the hypothesis is only held tenuously. And then they give the reasons for this. I would hope the best reasons. They say, for example, the Gospel is written in good Greek and displays sophisticated theology and is therefore unlikely to have been the work of a simple fisherman. Is that it? Is that why the Gospel of John is not attributed to John the Apostle? Because it was written in good Greek and displays sophisticated theology. Is that logical? Is that empirically verifiable? And does this comport with the way that we experience reality? Let's consider this for a moment. What about another prisoner that we know that received an education while in prison? Who can that be? Let's think about Nelson Mandela, since we're in South Africa. Nelson Mandela was born into the Madiba clan in the village of Mvezo in the Eastern Cape. This was during apartheid, right? It was a village in the Eastern Cape. Eventually, he would have 2 degrees, a Bachelor in Arts through the University of South Africa and an LLB through the University of South Africa. He got that in 1989. That he received while in the last months of his imprisonment on Robben Island. Now consider the following. If I was somebody that were 1,000 years from now to have read about Nelson Mandela, knowing what I know about the apartheid system, could I not make the following assertions, right? There's no way that a black man born in a small village in the Eastern Cape could attain 2 degrees, right? having the ability to speak in Afrikaans because he was just not educated. The work that we see here, his Long Road to Freedom, was written in English. It's not his primary language, right? So therefore, it couldn't have been him that wrote the book. Does that make sense? Because that's essentially what they're saying. And when it comes to the sophisticated theology, consider the following. John walked, ate, slept, and lived with Jesus for 3 years. For 3 solid years. That is a bachelor's degree, my friend. Judea was occupied by Rome that used Greek. So it's not like he grew up in a vacuum. He was imprisoned on the Isle of Patmos in a Roman prison. What was the guy going to do? So it is not reasonable to just dismiss 3 Christian fathers of Christianity, and say, well, what they're saying is rubbish, just because you feel like it. It doesn't comport with our 3 tests for truth. Let's look at some New Testament facts though. So first of all, we know we've got roughly 5,700 original Greek manuscript and manuscript portions. We've got about 10,000 Latin Vulgate and 9,300 other versions. These are little copies of the Gospels, of the New Testaments that are out there. That is a lot of content. More than that, we have got 36,000 quotations from the early church fathers. 36,000. The oldest copy that we have in our possession is about 50 years after the original, thought to be about 50 years after the original, and is about 130 years after the events. But we have over 24,000 manuscripts and complete copies that date between 50 and 300 years after they were originally written. The New Testament can be reliably constructed with more than 99% accuracy just by referencing the commentary on the writing in the first 200 years. That is insane. The modern New Testament is 99.5% free of textual discrepancies with no major Christian doctrine in doubt. There was this one guy that wrote a book that said that there was over 400,000 errors with the Bible. And then you find out that the vast majority of them is grammar and punctuation mistakes. So people are being disingenuous. 99.5% free of textual discrepancies with no major Christian doctrine in doubt. The majority of the New Testament books we have today was widely accepted and in circulation early on. There's a document called the Muratorian Fragment, which is the oldest list that we have of New Testament book that contains 23 of the 27 books and dates back to AD 170. So there is overwhelming evidence that what we received is actually legitimate. In fact, if we go and we compare the Bible, the New Testament, right, documents, with some other ancient documents, we find that the New Testament is a rock star by comparison. So the New Testament, like I said, is about 50 years between the document, the events taking place, and the earliest document that we have, right? But if we look at, for example, the history of Rome, or we look at Homer's Iliad, or we look at Tacitus' Annals, we'll see that there are hundreds and hundreds of years gaps in between the original and the oldest copy that we have today. What about external, non-Christian sources that verify the facts in the Bible? There are 17 non-Christian sources that mention Jesus. I've listed all of them there. You'll see them on your screen. 11 speak of death, the death of Jesus. 5 specifically mention death on a cross. This was in a book by Gary Habermas called Ancient Evidence for the Life of Jesus. So when were the Gospels written? Well, it depends on what your view is. I had a bit of a scratch on the internet trying to get this information. It took me some time to get it, but I've basically given you the range between the conservative and the liberal views. So if you look at Matthew, conservatively, written AD 40, which is a 7-year gap between the events taking place and writing the actual manuscript. The liberal view is that there's 57 years gap between the two. Mark, 12 years gap between if you're a conservative, 37 years if you are a liberal. Luke, 18 years gap if you are a conservative, 57 years if you're a liberal. John, 31 years gap if you're conservatives, 67 years gap if you are a liberal. Now what's interesting here is on the conservative view, it is within the lifetime of an individual. I can tell you details about my wedding that has taken place almost 20 years ago, right? Things that happened on that day. We've all had days like that. Things that we remember, traumatic events that we remember, right? Scary events, happy events that we remember. We can tell you what we were doing that day. Maybe what food we had, what songs we... It depends on the individual, but we can remember certain important things like that. So within the lifetime of an individual to have that committed down to paper, it's not like these people, it's not like hundreds of years went by before it was committed to paper. But there's also strong evidence for earlier dating prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. You see, the fall of Jerusalem took place in AD 70. Now, it's interesting that the entire New Testament fails to mention it. James, Jesus' brother, was martyred in Jerusalem in AD 62. Paul was martyred in Rome in AD 64. Peter was martyred in AD 65 by crucifixion, apparently, or upside down. Now, Luke wrote extensively of both Paul and Peter in the book of Acts and mentions James in Acts 15, and he says nothing about their deaths. Paul was still alive and under house arrest at the end of the book of Acts. Their deaths are completely missing, even though Luke described the death of Stephen and James the brother John. The conclusion must therefore be that the books were written prior to AD 70. And if that is the case, we've got like a 37-year gap between the events taking place and between the documents, maximum 37 years between the events taking place and the documents being published. The Australian archaeologist Clifford Wilson, formerly the director of the Australian Institute of Archaeology, said the following: "I know of no finding in archaeology that's properly confirmed, which is in opposition to scriptures. The Bible is the most accurate history textbook the world has ever seen." That is bold. That is extremely bold what he's saying. Now Luke starts off the Gospel of Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, by the following. He says, "Many have undertaken to draw up the account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the very first eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." How interesting is the words, right? There are many eyewitnesses. I myself have carefully investigated the orderly account so that you can be certain. In the book of Acts, Luke mentions 32 countries, 54 cities, 9 Mediterranean islands. He also lists 95 people by name, 62 of which were not named anywhere else in the New Testament. Some early critics occasionally charged Luke with errors. A few of them even suggested that he was quite careless. The discoveries of archaeology, however, have vindicated him in every instance. Every instance. So William Ramsey said the following: "I take the view that Luke's history is unsurpassed in its trustworthiness. You may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historian, and they will stand the keenest scrutiny and the harshest treatment." That is phenomenal to say about Luke, but it's also about the other gospel authors. Why believe the authors? Why should we believe that the New Testament is accurate? Well, we know that it was written early. If we compare it to other ancient documents, very early. They were quoted extensively. If you look at the 36,000 quotes that we have, it's a lot, right? There was an excellent chain of custody. They are backed by archaeology or pagan sources and described in great detail. For example, Paul's letters date as close to 2 years to the events. The theory of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 is very, very, very powerful. And J. Warner Wallace, who did excellent research on the unbroken chain of custody of the New Testament for 200 years after Jesus, cited Ignatius, Polycarp, Irenaeus, and Hippolytus as the chain of custody of Paul's letters. So we can actually see how the stuff gets handed down and if there's been changes made, and there weren't changes made. We actually get more complete story when we combine the various accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. J. Warner Wallace, in Cold Case Christianity, a fantastic book, if you can get it, read it. He actually does an analysis of the various accounts and shows you that the discrepancies that we see is actually not discrepancies, it's a characteristic of eyewitness accounts. And that these eyewitnesses describe details from different angles and actually fill in each other's story. It's a phenomenal book. Cold Case Christianity. You can actually check him out on YouTube. Fantastic guy. They had no motive to lie because they had nothing to gain. They weren't going to get rich. There was no money to be had back then. They weren't powerful, influential. And there was no sex to be had, unfortunately. Those are the three reasons J. Warner Wallace cites that people, historically, have done bad things. Is for those who have committed crimes, right? So why will you lie? Well, sex, money, power. Those are the three things. Why will you steal? Sex, money, power. So there's none of that. There's absolutely none of that in the New Testament authors. They weren't even believers at first. They only became believers after the crucifixion took place and after Jesus was resurrected. Some of them, like Paul, for example, was enemies of Christianity. And some of the events described were actually quite embarrassing. Many of them died for what they believed. Many of them died for what they believed. And what's fascinating to me is that all of the apostles were Jews first, right? They were brought up Jews. It's not like they were roped into a Jewish culture. They became Christians. They had certain views. They believed that it was a curse for a man to hang on a cross, to hang on a tree. They believed it was blasphemy for a man to say that he is God and punishable by death. They believed that. But yet, they would sacrifice their personal, financial, their community relationships in order to follow Jesus and even their lives. Why would you do that if you didn't believe that it was true? So in conclusion, there is ample evidence that the New Testament is a reliable document and that we can trust the Gospels and that we can trust the words of Jesus. Ultimately, we can trust the Bible and specifically the New Testament when it comes to our salvation. See you in the next session.